We have a surprise for you also. During the discussions that we had about this matter, a lot of discussion came up about Putin and about the personalities involved in the Ukraine crisis. And we talked about, and secondly, when I read to you this morning the mission and description of what a shared society is, obviously to achieve a shared society, you need empathy. Empathy in all citizens. You need to teach empathy in schools to achieve the kinds of ideals and values that are described there. And so we started talking about, is it really possible to build empathy into every person? And this, of course, is a psychology or a psychological issue. And so we called on our good friend, Dr. James Fallon. And Jim is right over here. When Jack leaves, Jim is going to come up here and talk about the psychology of this situation. And I'm going to read two paragraphs from his bio right now. It's a long and very impressive bio. I want to read just the first and the last, and then when we finish up, we're going to take about 20 minutes of discussion between the panelists, and then we're going to do a Q&A, and then at 11:30, we're going to release Judge Thunheim and invite Jim to come up here and speak. But Jim has become a very good friend, and when we get together, Jim does most of the talking, and for a very good reason. He's a fascinating person. He holds a Sloan Fellowship, a Senior Fulbright Fellowship for Africa, and NIH Research Career Award. He was chair of the University of California Irvine Faculty and Academic Senate and chair of the UCI College of Medicine faculty. He sits on numerous corporate boards and national think tanks for science, biotechnology, the arts, and the U.S. military. He's a subject matter expert in the field of cognition and war to the Pentagon's Joint Command. Jim and his colleagues are interested in the neural circuitry and genetics of creativity, artistic talent, extraordinary abilities, psychopathology, criminal behavior, and levels of consciousness. You can see why I'm reading this rather than just doing this from memory. Most recently, the past 2 years, he has appeared in over 30 national and international TV and radio specials on dictatorships, psychopathic behavior, murder, and violence. And in addition, Jim has played himself and is a writer for the TV series Criminal Minds. So Jim will come up and respond to what he's heard here today following the panel discussion now. And to make this really simple and actually sort of give most of the responsibility to the four speakers, I'm going to simply ask you to respond to one another, both to Roman's keynote speech and his views as a university student watching everything unfold in Ukraine, and Jack's comments on constitutional and political constitutional issues and political parties, and Guyer's 3 principles that he talked about, and Tom's harsh realities of Ukraine today. So one of you begin. I'm going to start with you, Jack. Would you like to respond to the others?
Well, I didn't hear anything that I disagreed with. I find the current dilemma that Tom outlined so well to be a very difficult one, and there's not much time. I think Ukraine needs time, and that was a point that Roman made, and rather than be forced into solutions that perhaps are imperfect. The people need time to heal. And I think that we're looking at elections that are far too soon. I could be wrong. I mean, it's possible that the elections can be healing, but I don't think so, and that is a big concern of mine as the next 2 weeks unfold.
And I'd like to ask Roman whether there's a generational issue here. When you take Ukrainians from the East whether the younger generation perhaps would have a view more similar to young people you have known in Ukraine. Have you met young Eastern Ukrainians who sort of have this same view? I mean, I like to think there's a generational divide in Eastern Ukraine.
I may say that young generation in the East, they think the same that we think in the western part of the Ukraine. And the people that I met, they really want to be a part of European Union in future and want to live in a nice society that we've been talking about. But still, some of them are influenced by Russian propaganda, and they still, think that Putin is a good Tsar, and they believe in it, and they follow this. And I know that one of my friends, he is studying in the university on the East, and I'm really good friends with him. And he said that if he would go for the protest, pro-Ukrainian protest, on East, he would get excluded from the university, and things like that. And so, again, they get brainwashed at the universities. They, get all of this information at schools from the teachers. And so most of them are believing all of this and believe in Russia being a nice partner for Ukraine. Okay.
Gaida, I was sitting next to you during the other speakers, and I heard you very quietly nodding or saying yes, sort of agreeing. And I'd like to have you sort of expand on your thoughts on the other comments that the others made.
Well, in expanding, maybe I find myself not so agreeable, but anyways, let me try to do that job. I felt myself in agreement with the description of the severity of the international situation, and also on the critical issues that we're facing since the Geneva Accord was made into a diplomatic reality on 17th April. Because although the principles of that Geneva Accord are clear to everyone present, the accord itself does not seem to reflect the situation on the ground, which makes the parties to that fragile accord engage in a blame game, which is not constructive for diplomatic solutions. But on the other hand, there might be some signals recently that what we could call a fragile and very necessitated OSCE process may actually produce some tangible results in the situation that we see. I would guess that for Russia's part, enhancing the role of the OSCE is something that they covet, that they want to see happen. I could also imagine, in pure realist terms, that Russia would be content with the situation as it is now, with this strip of land in the eastern part of Ukraine, having raised its voice towards the center and then created what we in international terms would call, if not a military buffer zone, then at least some sort of a social economic buffer zone in that part of Ukraine. So the realist outlook in Moscow is one that if we're not a part of it, we're going to sabotage it. It's a simple device that Russia is using and transforming into politics at the current moment. And I think that there is a recognition in European capitals, and I have to agree with the speaker on that, that something has to be done about that issue concretely. As to the snap elections, the presidential elections, when I was following the process unfolding from November to February, I was concerned too that in 3 months of standoff, that Rada would try to do too much too quickly, such as to call for a return to the 2004 elections to disband the linguistic laws or the language laws, and to try to rectify everything that had gone wrong since the elections of 2010 in a very short period. I could understand that, given the heated situation in Kiev and in Ukraine, but the academician in me said that, no, this is too much, too soon. I would have liked to see a process that was stretching over 12, 18 months to reach some sort of consolidation without aggravating the situation further. But the wisdom of hindsight is a poor wisdom, unfortunately.
Well, what happens if we have an election in a week that is boycotted by many, many people, which I'm very concerned it's going to be? I mean, where does that get us? Does that draw the ball backward? How does that get us forward at all? Any thoughts?
To me,
Yeah.
well, Ukraine has a population 46 million minus 1.2.3 after Crimea, and potentially also 6 million in the east. So any election conducted under that would only give a partial mandate for a new executive. But the strength of that partial mandate is important. And here I talk about the turnout in other places of Ukraine, which is important. People actually go out and vote. To give a mandate to that transitional government to transform into somewhat more durable executive power. But I am pessimistic as to that transforming into reality, unfortunately.
You know, when you look at the February 21st agreement, in which the EU and it was a large agreement on allowing Yanukovych to stay in power and then having elections. The idea was to do constitutional reform before that election, which calls for a lot of time. There's obviously not time for that now, and it looks like the Russians are accepting the idea of constitutional reform after the May 25th election, but only on the basis of this dialogue. In other words, there's some sign that the East will be included. Because I think otherwise, there'd be a question of whether that government was fully legitimate and would be a negotiating partner. There's got to be a negotiating partner here on the Ukrainian side for any of this to go forward. There's got to be some kind of a legitimate government in Ukraine, in Kiev. And the question is how you get there, and I agree with Jack that this seems awfully rushed. You know, there were rumors that the May 25th election might be postponed because of Yulia Tymoshenko. She's running behind. And there have been rumors that she might actually pull out, basically throw everything into a cocked hat, hoping to have more time for her own campaign. So there are a lot of wild cards in the air here.
Roman, you had a question.
I just want to go a little back and talk about these quick changes that we had that the new people who came to power did, like changing into the constitution and changing different laws really quickly. I just want to say that they almost, been forced to do that because people been standing behind the wall and waiting for them to do that. And the protesters from the Maidan have been waiting for it for a long time, and that's what they really wanted. And if politicians wouldn't do that, they would probably, crash everything there. So they were pretty much forced to do this. And I want to say that I think that it was rushed. I agree with the guys here. But I think that it was a nice decision to do that. And they're expecting to make changes to it in a little bit of a time, like in a half a year. They are going to go back to this question and discuss it more and make better changes. But at that time, it was needed to be done. And about the president election, again, I agree with everybody that I am pretty pessimistic about that. And it is rushed, and I think that it won't bring too much of a change. But at the same time, we need a person who can actually at least try to do something Because now we do not have a person who can say, you know, you have to do this, another person has to do this, and another ministry have to do this. We do not have, you know, like a ruler who can say what everybody has to do. Everybody is spread around, and there is no kind of a connection between different ministries and everything else, and they are not working together. And they need somebody to point out what they need to do. So at the same time, I think that that would be nice to have at least somebody who can do this, and it's my opinion on that.
Respond to Roman?
Yeah. All right.
Yeah,
Right.
but I perfectly understand the sentiments of Roman here. I do. Although I would say that in everything that I've read about democracy and how it works, I sort of always land on the procedural definition of democracy, which says that when the procedure takes a hold of the principles, then you're doing something right. And this is an instance where the principles took the higher ground of the procedures. There's nothing wrong about the principles, but if you sort of discard the procedures, then you may end up in deep water afterwards, because the very sort of promotion of the principles in that heated situation can cause that someone come back and say, hey, look at the procedures here. You violated the procedures. So that is why procedures are important, that all parts of the elite that invest in the procedures can say that, okay, the outcome, we didn't like it, but the procedures were okay. So.
Anyone else?
May I?
Yes.
Okay, and so I just want to say that another problem is, as I'm saying, there is no person that anybody can trust, any politician. And we're not talking just about people from the east, but we are talking people from the western part of Ukraine too. I mean, people do not trust politicians at all. And whatever they are doing, they try to find something bad in it. And there is no people or person in power who can actually explain how it works, because people really do not want to listen to this. They want changes, and they want them to be quick, and they cannot wait. And that's the problem, because there is no trust between people and the politicians. And there is no person that people can actually trust to and believe what they are saying. So that's another problem.
Thank you.
I agree with Roman. I mean, I think that right now there's fundamental distrust in the entire political system. And electing someone to run the country in 2 weeks will be just another politician. There's no buildup of trust in a political system, which I think you need more fundamental discussion and reform, particularly constitutional reform, before you can start rebuilding that trust in politicians. And that's why I think that some thought at least should be given to perhaps a caretaker government where you don't have people who are interested in their own personal futures. They're interested in rebuilding the country and the country's future, and have a slower build-up to an election that can start to rebuild the trust in the political system.
Okay, we're going to open it up to Q&A now. And if you have a question, I don't think we have a microphone here, but I don't think we will need one. Just speak loudly, stand up, say your name, and if you represent an organization, please let us know who you're representing. Maureen.
Yes, good morning. Maureen Reed from the Nobel Peace Prize Forum in Minneapolis. My question, actually there are two, and maybe directed first to you, Judge Thunheim, and then perhaps to others. What are the two or three most important constitutional questions to be addressed in the Ukraine? And then the second question is, are those two or three constitutional questions fundamentally different than other emerging democracies have faced? And then a third question for any of you, many of you who have worked in other countries. what have you seen occur as other countries have faced those similar kinds of constitutional questions that you believe would shed light or show promise for Ukraine successfully dealing with them?
I think there are two issues that are critical. One is to develop much more of a power sharing regime. One side takes all and controls all power clearly hasn't worked and has led to this fundamental distrust. And the second is, and I think this is important, I mean, I think there are the foundations of a fairly good system of the rule of law in Ukraine. There are good people in places that would like to do their jobs better. I think there are changes that are needed in how judges are appointed and how they are their terms affecting their independence. And so I think development of a strong, independent, impartial judiciary to cement the rule of law, which then can get at a lot of the other issues like corruption, like the economic situation that so afflicts the country. So as far as how this is different, I don't think it's fundamentally different from a lot of other new democracies. It's occurring on a stage that is inflamed by the crisis right now, which is perhaps at least slightly different than other places that have had to shift to a new system quickly. We don't have the time for a 2 or 3 year national debate as to what the Constitution should look like. It has to be done faster, but the public needs to be included nonetheless. So that's how I would describe that. Maybe my colleagues.
Yeah. Maureen, I would say that probably two fundamental principles are going to be assuring the rights of the opposition, that's clear in the Constitution, and then, as I say, some kind of federal structure. As I say, the Russians are insisting on elected governors. That's their basic desiderata here. Other countries, Thailand is going through exactly the same debate right now. The opposition in Thailand is saying we have to have a caretaker government of experts while we redo the Constitution before an election. And the courts are getting involved. It's very polarized there. It's a north-south thing also. It's regional, potentially. So this happens in other countries. Examples of how other countries who got out of this dilemma: the United States. We struggled our way toward a federal system in which states have very strong rights. Germany adopted our basic idea in Germany, the Federal Republic of Germany. The Länder have very strong rights. And I think in Somalia right now, they're trying to figure out a way to, I mean, the problem in many countries is you're down to the clan level. You're down to very small groups, or Libya. How do you galvanize that in a federal way when the divisions are that minute? But I think in the case of Ukraine, you've really got two basic blocks, which it ought to be a workable situation under the right set of circumstances.
Garrett?
Yes. Much has been said about these issues, and I just wanted to add a couple of issues as well. Because when you are looking at the place of constitutional reform in the transition from authoritarianism towards democracy, you're looking at a scale that might look similar across cases. And you would say that the most important thing is that the Constitution is in place before elections. If you hold elections before the Constitution is in place, you might face different problems and so forth. But for Ukraine, one specific issue is that Ukraine negotiated the Constitution over 5 years, from 91 to 96. In 96, the Constitution was in place. And when it was tried amended to reinforce the powers of the presidency in 2000, people reacted. The elite reacted also. They didn't want to see that amendment enter into the Constitution. And that was one of the core issues for the Orange Coalition to mobilize, that they wanted a clearer understanding of a regime as a division of power rather than winner takes it all system. According to what we have perhaps seen under Yanukovych, that he not only won the presidency, but he wanted to win the courts, and he wanted to win the parliament, and plurality in parliament, and all these things. So this mentality is one of the core issues in Ukraine. And I can understand that why a part of the Ukrainian elite has a vested interest in power sharing. But there is another strong party in the Ukrainian elite that has no vested interest in power sharing. And that is one of the core case-specific issues in Ukraine at present. And that may explain also the heated debates around the constitution.
Roman.
And I just wanted to add a little bit about the power sharing. And nowadays the government tries to initiate a new law that they're going to pass. And it's not about power sharing between two parties, but it's going to be a power sharing between the regions of Ukraine. So they want to not like federalize it, but like give more opportunities and more power to the regions, so they kind of can decide what they want to do.
Okay, we have a question in the back of the room. And then,
From a company called New Times. We had two presidents the last 20 years, which has tried to become the Chuck Norris of international politics. We had George Bush, the young one, and we have Putin. Both of them has tried to be an extremely strong action man. Putin was elected the national leader of the year in Time magazine last year. And his popularity now outside Europe is stronger than ever. He's got the highest approval rate inside Russia. The highest approval rate, higher than Yeltsin ever had. How can you explain that? And George Bush lost that Chuck Norris position, while Putin has obviously seemed to gain on it. That's the one thing. The one question, how can we explain Putin's strong role in the world today? Second is, how can we avoid Ukraine becoming the new Jerusalem? You know, if you explain the war in the Middle East, you have to look at the big global powers, the US and Russia. And how can we need to get some dialogue in Russia and the US, otherwise it will fail. How can we do that? That's the big question.
That's a good set of questions. And remember at one point, George W. Bush looked into Putin's eyes and saw somebody he could deal with.
So his soul.
He saw his soul even, yes. So, Putin, the narrative I described about NATO expansion and sort of, and it's a narrative, is widely shared in Russia, also by young Russians. The idea that Russia gave up a lot over a number, many years after the end of the Cold War, but sort of here and no further. What's a dilemma is that this narrative is getting some resonance in Western Europe. Germany today is very interesting. They even have a concept for it. It's called Russland verstehen, understanding Russia. Not approving, but understanding. The three previous German chancellors before Merkel have all expressed understanding for what Putin is doing. Very unfortunately, Spiegel magazine had a cover article 2 weeks ago, How Western Are the Germans? And this is, when I was in Washington just a couple weeks ago for meetings at the State Department, and there's a lot of concern about this because Germany itself is becoming a regional power in many ways. Margaret Thatcher opposed German unification to her last ascension today. I was active in the unification period, and the British and the French had grave misgivings about having Germany unite quickly. And Thatcher, I remember her argument was, once it's united, it will look east. It will have Eastern interests again. And so this is a dilemma within the alliance right now. I think this is one reason that the Germans are getting, Merkel was in Washington a couple weeks ago. I think that they worked out on during that visit that the Germans would take the lead at this point. So yeah, Putin, in America, we see him as a kind of a deranged figure. I think in old Europe, they see him as a traditional balance of power figure. The model for Putin, and actually this gentleman's portrait, hangs on the wall of Foreign Minister Lavrov. is Prince Gorbachev, who was the foreign minister of Russia after the Crimean War in the 19th century, and who, from a position of weakness after that war, used Russian diplomacy to restore. And Putin's premise for Russia today is that it's weak. It's in a demographic crisis. You know, I don't know if you noticed, and by the way, when you're in Norway here with all these baby carriages everywhere, it's hard to believe that a country could be in a demographic crisis. But you know, at the end of the Olympics, with the big the big ceremony the Russians put on, it culminated with women pushing baby carriages around. That was the final scene of that Russian history exposition. Women stopped having children after the collapse. They have a very tiny generation right now of military-aged men. There are limits to what the Russians can do, and they know it. They really cannot invade Ukraine in any large way. So they're playing what they have. They're playing from a position of weakness. As I say, I think that this is not understood at all in the US, but when you read the German debate, it's a lively debate and more understood. So yes, his popularity is surprisingly, or at least understanding for him is surprisingly high.
I would add that I think our next speaker is going to have some interesting insights into Putin and his style of leadership, and I look forward to hearing that. But, you know, I'd like Roman's thought on this. I think in terms of a divided Ukraine, I've spent time in the eastern part of Ukraine, before the crisis happened, of course, but there wasn't a desire for an independent country, for a division. I mean, I think there's a deep desire for a united Ukraine. You just have to find the right steps to get to that point. And I'd like Roman's thought on that, because I don't think fundamentally many of the people in the eastern part of Ukraine want to be part of a separate country. They want to be part of a united Ukraine that protects their economic futures and their human rights and their own belief systems. And so I think the opportunity is there, but finding the right steps to get to that direction is the challenge.
Okay, Roman, and then I saw there was a question right over there afterwards.
Okay, so if we go from the point of view of people who live on the East, so first when all of these things with this green man with the guns in Crimea began, and people have been saying that they want to be part of Russia because so there is people from the western part of Ukraine coming, and they're neo-Nazis, and they want to kill all of them. Nobody sees them, but they've been talking about them. And now, when they actually saw a support of Western Ukraine, I would say, because people from the West actually try to understand them and try to support them, come there, talk to them, and they are not as much against West as they were, but they more against the parliament and the government that we have right now. They do not like them because they bring troops into the eastern regions and making an anti-terroristic operations there. And that's why nowadays it probably even helped to unite Ukraine even more than it was before. I mean, people started to understand each other, but now they have another enemy, that is government, that nobody trusts.
Question.
My name is Luke Oakley. I'm living over here in Norway to be near my small children. First of all, we'll be Norwegians here. Thank you for being our friends and allies. We appreciate it. I'm a cold warrior. My issue was the Katyn massacre. I think I convinced Martha Mautner, who was a contemporary of George Kennan in the Moscow embassy after the war, to make Katyn the silver bullet Glasnost issue that helped bring the Soviet regime down. But part of I'm in basic agreement with the shared society idea of democratization, absolutely. And that's what we wanted for the Russian people, as well as other peoples of Eastern Europe. But we've pushed things, and Putin spoke about Kosovo being the first instance of the overthrow of international rule of law. Most folks here may not know about Appendix B of the Rambouillet Treaty, which was our unconditional occupation, unconditional surrender ultimatum, which the Serbs could not accept. And that was our pretext to start bombing them. And in the Kosovo War, NATO, from a legitimate defensive alliance, transformed into an interventionist, the Russians would say aggressor alliance. And then we've had Iraq, Libya, Syria. So, since the rule of law has been broken as far back as Kosovo, wouldn't a final realistic resolution to all this be a partition of Ukraine like there should have been a partition of Kosovo? Secondly, does everybody know here what the Russians' dead hand protocol is that we're living under right now because they feel so threatened? And finally, once again, we appreciate Norwegian's friendship and alliance. But when it looks like we're going in the wrong direction, the NATO Titanic headed for disaster, we need you to tell us as friends and allies, don't burn our flag, just ask some questions. So, 3 questions: partitioning, the dead hand protocol, and we want Norwegians to be more vocal, questioning us politically.
Well, Kosovo is obviously an important, the Russians raise Kosovo all the time. And in the run-up to Kosovo got its full independence months before the Georgian invasion in 2008. And once again, the Russians cited that again and again as an example. Of course, it's different. That was a war. There really were atrocities going on. In the last decades, traditional international law, which is based on the Treaty of Westphalia and the rights of states, inviolability of borders, has ceded ground to a more human rights-based, universal values-based approach to international law, whether it's genocide or responsibility to protect, which was invoked in Libya. This is the classic kind of idealist, realist dilemma that I was alluding to in my remarks, that we're going to be facing more and more as we go forward. One of the low points of this debate came a couple weeks ago in Germany, where former Chancellor Gerhard Schröder, who, as I said, had been expressing some understanding for Putin, was asked very bluntly, but Putin has broken international law here. He has violated the norms of international behavior. And Schröder responded, heck, so did I. So did I. I was chancellor during Kosovo. This was an astonishing response to that question. I don't know. Partition, I agree with Jack that I think that most Ukrainians want to keep the country together. And the question is, and this comes once again to a moral dilemma, do we have a Finlandized, do we go in the Russians' direction, especially regarding elected governors and non-NATO status for Ukraine? Do we go that far? Or is that being too realist and selling out the Ukrainians? George W. Bush, in the 50th anniversary of the Yalta Agreement, George W. Bush gave a speech in Prague on the way to the festivities in Moscow. In that speech, he declared that if he had been president, he would not have signed the Yalta Agreement because it consigned Eastern Europe to servitude, and that one should never favor stability over freedom.
Just one comment on Kosovo. As Tom says, the atrocities were extreme. The ethnic Albanians were being removed from the country, and there were mass killings everywhere, going both directions. But I remind you that Kosovo was an autonomous region within Yugoslavia. It was never, at least in the last 30 years of Yugoslavia, it wasn't a primary part of Serbia. The traditional boundaries are kept. There are Serb majority communities that have very significant human rights protection, constitutional protection, with the hope that they'll grow back to a situation that existed many years ago where the ethnic Albanians and ethnic Serbs lived together harmoniously for long periods of time. So I think it's a little different situation there.
Yeah.
Partition, to me, never seems to me to be a good idea. It's like the extreme idea when all else fails, and I don't think we're at that point in Ukraine.
Jack, maybe you could very briefly just tell the audience your background with Kosovo, and then Geir is going to speak, and then I think we're going to have to wrap it up so that we can have Dr. Fallon come up.
Yeah, I helped the UN put together a legal system after the UN took over administrative control of Kosovo after the war in 1999, and then eventually through that work help them put together a constitution that I think really does the job of keeping the country together, but in a way that has distinct protections for minority rights, in a way that perhaps go far beyond what other countries have given to minorities. And I think that's the best way to go forward in a country that has distinct majorities and minorities, is full protection of rights and creating that dialogue that the Shared Society Project talks about.
Geir.
Well, I think my response to this question about partition would be that I think we should be careful, again, not to take certain principles out of context and then apply them as guidelines for action in a different context. Normally, it seems like we sort of comprise a principle, the Kosovo principle, and then someone rejects that principle without looking into the fact that the Balkan Wars started in 1992 and peaked in Kosovo in 1999. Atrocities have been going on for many years, and the international community at that time adopted 1244, calling for action, and there was support for it, and there was even some support for the UN-led administration that was instated by 1244, that they should work as an administration for Kosovo as long as needed. That was one of the clauses in that resolution. So what happened in 2008, many years after the Balkan War started, was the legal consequence of 1244, as it were. The unilateral declaration from Kosovo to be independent. That is at least how I read this particular incident. And taking the principle and then transforming it into guideline for action, and in order to get support for it, I read Putin's 18 March speech. I find that very erratic. I find it it's impossible for me personally to accept as a sort of a reason for taking part of territory and then looking forward to partition.
Thank you very much. Jack, Tom, Roman, Geir, thank you so much for your input and insight today. Jack, safe travels back home. And Roman, I want to be around 20 years from now to see where you are in the hierarchy of the leadership of your country. I'm very proud to be your friend. Thank you.